Hey everybody, my name is Ian. I work in the Panther Lab Makerspace, and every second Saturday we do the Maker Showcase. This week I have a special guest. Her name is Cathy Zielske, and I want to welcome her onto the Maker Showcase.
Hey Ian, thank you so much for having me. It's really cool to see you in this space when I normally see you in the YouTube space, but I'm really honored that you invited me on.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to kind of mesh my two worlds together. So tell us a little bit about the type of maker that you are.
Well, that's a good question. So it's a long and short story at the same time. Basically, I am by trade a graphic designer. And I've worked as a graphic designer, primarily focusing in print, in magazines and print and corporate type materials. I think we're pushing 30 years now, because I've been around the block. I'm not some ingenue. I just want to be clear. And I have been working as a graphic designer for many, many years. But in addition to the print world that I have been part of, I got into crafting about 20 years ago. And I sort of found a way to merge and meld the two areas. So creating things like scrapbook pages and crafty projects. And more recently, I've gotten into card making, all the while still being a graphic designer and transitioning more into designing products for crafters. So it's kind of been this weird path from corporate America and very corporate design into a much more, I don't know, freer or craftier realm, if you will. But that's what I do. I'm a graphic designer. That's the short answer.
All right, cool. Graphic designer that kind of led into crafting and card making.
Right.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool. So talk a little bit, if you would, about your education background. Like, what inspired you to go to school and start learning about graphic design?
Well, that is also a great question. So, Ian, I have to tell you, I have a very soft spot for the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, because I'm actually a graduate of University of Texas, Arlington. So I ended up living in Texas for a few years and finished school in Texas. I lived in Grapevine, fabulous town, and this was in the late 80s. So I went to school and got my degree in journalism. And because I always wanted to be a writer. Design was not in the plan. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I was always good at writing, but I wasn't really an artsy kind of person. So I thought journalism is a good fit. So I'm in my senior year at UTA, and I got a job. I got a part-time job at Minyard Food Stores in Coppell, Texas, back when they were a company, because apparently they're not anymore, which kind of breaks my heart. But they had an opening for a journalism intern for the Minyard Country News. So the Minyard Country News was their employee magazine, and my job was to go out and take my tape recorder and interview store managers and interview produce managers and, just basically go out and cover the news of the Minyard Food Stores empire. That's how I got my foot in the door of this corporate world of writing and journalism. So I graduated from UTA in 1989 with that cherished degree in journalism. I met a boy from Minnesota while I was in Texas, and long story short, I moved to Minnesota. I married him. He's just in the other room working from home, just like all of us. But I came to Minnesota and got another job in journalism, right in my field. But that job, when I started it, it was a small trade association. They said, "Oh, by the way, we need you to write all these articles, but we also design everything we write." And I was like, what do you mean? Well, we do desktop publishing here. We have a whole Macintosh computer set up, and so we're going to need you to actually do the layout and design. So I knew nothing about it. I knew how to write a story, but I didn't know how to lay things out. And that was in 1990. And I basically jumped in, both feet first, if you will, to try to figure out how to do desktop publishing, because we had to design the magazines and the brochures and the corporate reports. So I had no design training. I had taken one advertising class at UTA, and it was seriously the dumbest class, and no, not to impugn, but we really didn't study design. So I had no experience in it. I just bought a lot of books, and I found out that I was pretty good with the technical side. So back then we were using PageMaker. It wasn't even Adobe. It was called Aldus PageMaker. And I just read everything I could and figured out how to put type on a digital page and then send that page to a print shop. So that's kind of how I got into it. And I realized I had much more of a passion for the design aspect than I did the writing. So the writing background was great, but I fell in love with design. I fell in love with typography. I fell in love with the digital emerging field of desktop publishing. And I just decided to soak up everything I could get to be good at it. You know what I'm saying? So that's kind of how it started. And I just never looked back.
Wow, that is an incredible journey. It's, something that I'm finding out with a lot of makers is that they are starting off in one field, or they're starting off at one point knowing exactly what they want to do, and then life kind of throws them that weird curveball, and they fall into this place that feels more comfortable to them.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. And for many years I think I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder, feeling somewhat inadequate as an artist, right? Because I didn't go to art school. My degree is in journalism. And I'll tell you what, I worked for many years at that first job I got in Minnesota, like 7 years. I was at this trade association. And side note, it was a trade association for the debt collection industry, which is not a sexy industry to design things for, but I will tell you, our brochures looked really good. But I left that job and I went to work, and I think you will appreciate this, Ian. I went to work for the Science Museum of Minnesota. I got a job in their print production department. And it was at that job where the guys who brought me in, they thought, well, you're probably a little more qualified for this little production artist job, but we're going to bring you in. It was like the best thing that could have happened to me. These two guys that I worked with, incredible designers, knew so much more than I did, because at my old job, I was the one that knew how to do the things. When I came to this job at the Science Museum, they taught me things that basically allowed me to take my career to a different level, to a more, just a higher caliber of work and design. And I learned so much from these guys. And it was after that experience, worked with them for a couple of years, that the chip kind of went away, because I'm like, I've earned the right to call myself a graphic designer. And it was such a creative place to work. One day I'd be working on the latest, science exhibit materials. And the next day I'd be doing a brochure about, our Hmong artifact collection. Like, there was such a variety of content to work with. It was a fantastic experience, but a learning experience where I was really able to grow by working with people that were so much better than me. Yeah.
That's really cool. And I love, it's great to be able to have that variety where you can really jump in and have one thing one day, and then the next thing it flips it completely upside down, and you're doing something completely different. So
I
can definitely see how that would be a really important thing and a really great thing to help you grow.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
So currently you design stamp sets, you design dies, you do a lot of design mostly for card makers, but also scrapbooking and stuff like that. Can you talk a little bit about your process on what it takes to put together a stamp set and a die set, and all the work that kind of goes behind that?
Sure. I'm going to back up a little bit, Ian, because the transition from corporate design into what became the craft world, that actually happened as I quit my job because I had my second child and couldn't afford, to have 2 kids in daycare. I just didn't make enough as a graphic designer at that time. And in my spare time, what little I had as a freelancer, I started freelancing. I started scrapbooking. That turned into something that shocked me because I had this preconceived notion about scrapbooking was cheesy and weird and kitschy and here's what I did. I decided to bring a graphic design aesthetic to that hobby. And I thought, well, if I design things that are clean and simple in publication form, why not do that in scrapbooking? So I did. What that led to was hooking up with a publication in Utah at the time called Simple Scrapbooks Magazine. Sent some of my pages in there, and they liked them. And they said, I don't know who you are, but I'd like to work with you. And I said, same. And before you know it, within a few years, I was the art director for their magazine in Utah. And the reason I have to bring that up is because that is the bridge to getting me into the craft world, into designing products for crafters, because it would have been off my radar, right? Had I not known about scrapbooking. I wrote a couple books on scrapbooking. Like, I was all in, and especially in terms of like just keeping it clean, keeping it simple, et cetera, and so on. The years roll on, and the magazine that I worked for went out of business. And then, strangely enough, another magazine that has been going strong for 14 years, they came and knocking and said, hey, do you want to work for us as our art director? I'm like, yes, please. So I'm able to keep working in the craft industry as a behind the scenes person, all the while, teaching my own scrapbooking classes online, designing products for scrapbookers that are more on the digital realm. But what that led to was in 2017, the woman I worked for, who I still work for now, she said, oh yeah, we need to have you do some cards for an issue. I know you're not really a card maker, but we're going to do a special push for something related to cards. Can you make some? And I'm like, all right, I guess. And she sent me some products, a die cut machine, right? And I had a die cut machine years earlier. I didn't know what to do with it. And so I gave it to my neighbor. That first project where I had no idea what I was doing, that was my gateway drug into designing craft stuff for card makers and stamps and dies. So I knew nothing about this industry at all, the cards, nothing about it. And that was what started me on this path that I have merged into. I've got another lane going here where I learned about stamps and dies. So the process is one that I had to just kind of learn on my feet. And I decided, well, I'm going to try to design some of my own stamps. I'm going to see how that all works. And luckily for me, because I've been working in the craft world for so long, I had a lot of connections with good friends who were doing the same thing. They shared, this is how I do it. And, we do everything in Adobe Illustrator because it all has to be vectorized. And here's some companies in Iowa that will print your stamps domestically. And just all of this information, just a lot of people shared some good stuff with me. So I was able to start getting into it. And then I reached out to Simon Says Stamp when I realized that doing it all myself, like the production and the fulfillment, it's just like a little bit above my pay grade. I started working for a bigger company. And yeah, so I don't know. I just thought making that leap into the process, do you know what I'm saying? It's like it was about, 18 years to go from I'm going to make scrapbook pages to now I design stamps and dies. And
yeah, it's really important that, I mean, again, we kind of talked about it and touched on it earlier, that weird like curveball that life sends you, and it turns out to be such an amazing opportunity, and a lot of things come from those opportunities. So I think, one of the lessons that hopefully people will take away from this is always, kind of pay attention to those curveballs. You never know when they can lead into a brand new opportunity that will steer you on another life path.
Well, and not only that, Ian, anyone who's watching who thinks, well, I'm not really that artistic, I'm not really that creative, like that was kind of how I saw myself. Like I always knew I could write. Writing was something, from when I was a little kid, and writing short stories, that wasn't my issue. But I never felt creative in other ways. I don't draw. My handwriting looks like chicken scratch. So the fact that I found this career as a designer, there are so many ways we can be creative, I think, that we aren't aware of. And I think so many kids, when they realize they can't draw or they can't paint, somehow they might check a box in their mind that says, well, I'm not very creative. That's not true. I love the creativity that comes from typography and designing stamp sets. Now it's like, I don't illustrate, right? But I do a lot of type-based stamp sets, or I pay for the expanded rights for other people who can draw, and then I incorporate their work into the stamp sets that I create. So there are just so many ways to be creative that I think we shut ourselves down to. And that's something I really want to stress, is that you might not think you're the most creative person in the world, but I think we all have areas that can bring that out. You know, it's just finding what you're really passionate about, and not writing yourself off. So.
Yeah, absolutely. My guest from last month, JC Begornia, he talked about, you know, people can be creative in ways that they don't think of. And maybe they're not artistically creative, but maybe they're musically creative, or even as something as simple as thinking of a new way to solve a problem mathematically. Like, there are so many other ways to be creative besides art. So I absolutely think it's a great point to bring up of, you know, don't just tick off that box saying that you're not creative.
Right, right. And it's funny that you mentioned math. Like, I never thought of I mean, I'm terrible at math, right? Terrible at math. But graphic design is math. It's just a different kind of math. When you're given some images and some words and you're told to make them look good together, that is spatial, right? That is a spatial ability that you have to have, and you can hone that skill. That is my math. So even becoming a designer made me feel smarter in areas that I didn't even think I had any skill.
That's really cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's a great way to think about it.
It's my math. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're designing, when you're creating, when you're making, what are some of the tools that you use most frequently?
Okay, well, mostly I use the Adobe Creative Suite for pretty much everything. But for designing stamps and dies, I use Adobe Illustrator, because, as I had mentioned earlier, everything we send to our various production houses has to be vectorized format so that everything will be crisp and perfect and, you know, be created exactly as intended. So the funny thing is, Adobe Illustrator is my Achilles heel. And it always has been. I mean, I go back to the PageMaker days, okay, when it was all this PageMaker before Adobe took it all over. And I used Photoshop a lot at the Science Museum, but I never touched Illustrator. Illustrator, still to this day, if you check my Google history on YouTube, it is always things like how to do XYZ in Illustrator. But I know enough to be dangerous, but I'm fortunate to work with a lot of really talented designers for the company that I design for, and I'll text them like, you know, 11 o'clock at night, how do you do this again? And they always come through. So it's the Adobe Creative Suite, but for stamps and dies, it is purely working in Illustrator. And then of course we use Photoshop for, you know, creating our package previews and the things that you see on a website, that sort of thing. But I'm getting better slowly, but never say an old dog can't learn new tricks. And I'm not saying I'm old, but I'm a little, you know, I graduated in '89. I'm just saying.
I don't think so, Kathy. I don't think so at all. Yeah, it's another, you know, I tell kids whenever they come into the makerspace, or anybody really, whenever they come into the makerspace, that Google is my friend. I use Google for so many things, and people shouldn't be ashamed of using Google to answer even simple questions about anything, really. It's always about using your resources and your skills. And of course, at the library, we have lots of resources for you to check out. So always feel free to come to the library and learn more about whatever you want to learn about, of course, because we have those resources available to you. So it sounds like you spent a lot of time at the library, whether you were in school or elsewhere.
Well, I spent a lot of time with books. Yes, Ian, and especially at when I was at the Minyard food stores. That was before the internet, people, back in the olden days. And I did check out books and purchase books on design theory, because I didn't know, you know, they were wanting me to tell them how to lay things out on their digital system there. I didn't know anything about it. So pre-internet, I bought a lot of books on design.
Yep.
And I tended to buy them more than check them out, because I thought I'm going to need this again and again. And, you know, so and I guess we live in a different time now where kids can look up anything they want, but that's the beauty of it. It's like, if you have a creative subject that you're interested in, type in that search field or, you know, like you said, go to the library, check out a book. There are just so many great resources and ways that we can learn to kind of enhance our creativity, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of enhancing creativity, I'm curious, has there been anybody in your life that has been inspirational to you on this path? Is there any kind of like people that really inspired you either along this path or design wise or just in general?
You know, I'm going to have to go back to the two guys that I worked with at the Science Museum. Their names are Lawrence and Jeff. And both of them were, so they were like the opposite of me. Both of them went to the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, which is a really prestigious school here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area where I live. An expensive school, right? They're both MCAD grads. And here's me with my journalism degree from UTA. They just had something I didn't have, which was, at that time, I think I call it just this relentless pursuit of just excellence. So I learned so much from them. I remember one time I was working on a brochure for one of our school programs, because as you know, a museum, you've got so many school groups coming in, right? And it was some sort of school enrichment program, and I'm working on my brochure series, and I was very nervous, thinking, you know, I don't want to mess up. I don't want these guys to think I'm a fraud. And I remember Lawrence, who is my boss, coming over my shoulder, and he's from Canada. Okay, so he had this subtle Canadian accent, and he points to the screen and he goes, "Can you zoom in right there?" And I'm looking over my shoulder, and I'm like, okay. And he points to an area of about 2 pixels that wasn't perfectly lined up and locked to a grid. And he goes, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "That needs to be perfect." Now, that might sound like really critical, but from a technical production standpoint, they just taught me to care about what you are doing in your work. And I think that is such a good lesson in general. If you can care and be relentless about pursuing the best that you can in the work that you're doing. That's what I learned from them. They inspired me to this day, Ian. If I'm working on something like, let's say I'm designing a digital template, for example, you better believe every single time I zoom in to 6,000% to make sure that Photoshop grid is locked and tight and perfect, because my biggest fear is that someone will pick up one of my templates someday, zoom in and be like, "Oh, that Cathy Zielske doesn't care about detail at all." So those two, working with those two guys, those two designers, that is what set me sort of on a course for really caring about the craft of what I was doing and being excellent. It isn't necessarily about perfection, but it's about giving everything you have to it and doing the best that you can. You know what I'm saying? So that was my biggest inspiration. And, you know, in terms of design idols, they were my idols. Not other people, not big famous people. I can't tell you, you know, anything about Adrian Frutiger, who designed my favorite typeface. Okay, he designed Avenir. That I know. I don't have design heroes in that regard. It's just the people that I've known and the people that I've been fortunate enough to work with and who have been generous with me.
That's a great story, Cathy. Thank you very much for sharing that. That's really awesome. And I totally, a lot of times people very personal to us can be much more of an inspirational person than celebrities or anybody like that. So yeah, absolutely. Very cool. Well, I'm curious, do you have anything that you would like to kind of show everybody and talk about? Do you have any examples of stuff that you do?
No.
Okay.
Okay, but here's something you should know, Ian, and I don't know if this is interesting for people out there who are trying to carve out a creative space in their life. So I have been self-employed since my son was born. He's going to be 21, so it's going on 21 years. And that self-employment has included, I have a lot of freelance clients that I design for and work for, but I have been in this office all those years. And this is an office that is not a crafting space. This is where I work. This is where I design stamps and dies. This is where I lay out and design magazines. This is where I manage my own website. And this is where I edit and do voiceovers for my YouTube videos. The crafting space is one floor down because this is not set up for that. So I have 2 different spaces that I work in. And part of that was a necessity. This is a small office. It's also the hottest room in the house. And I mean, I don't have quite what you guys have down in Texas. It's not like Texas hot, but it's not a good place for paper when there's humidity and things like that. So I have 2 different spaces that I work in. All my crafting things are down in my dining room. And we don't eat there. We just sort of make things in there. And so I have two defined spaces, and I'm really fortunate that, you know, my family doesn't really complain that we don't eat in the dining room. We have an eat-in kitchen and there's only 4 of us when we're all home. So I don't have anything in this space other than, you know, the computer over my shoulder where all the magic happens.
That's okay.
Yeah,
That's okay. I think that may be something interesting to kind of talk about too, because what advice do you have for people? Because obviously makers, sometimes they don't have their own space to work in. They're having to share it with, you know, other people, their families, stuff like that. So what are some kind of, I guess, tips or suggestions that you can give for makers who don't have that dedicated space and have to share it with other people?
Well, one thing that you can do, which is really what I started out all those years ago when I started to scrapbook, I just had a little corner in the dining room. I had a little corner, it was kind of tucked away, and I had a little table, and I put my papers there, and I bought a little paper rack. I just carved out a small space for me to do that crafty stuff. It is not what it has turned into today, which is, you know, custom cabinets that I had built. And I mean, it's hilarious to walk through there because it's always a mess and it's always crafty. And there's, you know, always adhesive stuck to the floor and stickers and glue. But it didn't start that way. And I think you can, if you just can carve out a little space that you can have to store your things that you're working on, maybe easily bring them out. I know a lot of people that do not have the tricked out craft room. In fact, I did a craft room tour of my dining room, which is pretty hilarious because I wanted people to understand that, like, even someone who works in this industry, I still have to kind of jerry rig it all together to make it work. So, you know, I don't think you need to have that custom room, but a couple drawers maybe in your dining room or your kitchen where you can just keep your stuff together. Start small, you know, and have it be as portable as it can be. That's a great way to start, you know, before you do what I do, which is take over the entire dining room. And I did have to empty it all out for Thanksgiving because it was our turn to host this year, and everything had to come upstairs. Oh, that's good times. But it worked out.
That sounded like a process to get everything up there.
Nobody had glitter in their food. You know what I'm saying? It all worked out.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. I do think it would be rather hard if your making ability is welding. It's probably not the best idea to do that in the dining room. And maybe crafting's pretty safe. You know what I mean? I mean, the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to have an heat embossing accident or an unfortunate glitter spill, which are the worst, the worst. But otherwise. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So even if your making ability or your making interest isn't something that can be contained within an indoor space, you know, try to find that area maybe in the garage or find a way to carve that space out so that way you can hone in on your skills and then over time allow that to build up.
Right. And the other thing you have to do, Ian, for whatever you want to make, like I envy quilters. Oh my gosh, I envy quilters. I follow quilters on social media and I look at what they're doing. I know you quilt, Ian. I've seen something, you know, I follow other makers and it doesn't really matter like whatever area it is, but what you can do is immerse yourself. Even before you get started, like see what people are doing, see what the tools are, see if the tools are things that you can amass over time. You know, you don't have to have it all at once to get started, but it's always good to know what are the tools of this particular craft. What can I budget for? What can I borrow if need be? And, you know, take your time. I know when people get into crafting, especially like scrapbooking or card making, boy, we want to go all in. In 2017, I spent a lot of money on things for card making because I didn't have those things, and I figured out what are the things, and then I just worked my way towards the things. You know, luckily for me, it's part of my business, so it can factor into my taxes, but still, you have to know, like, what are the tools of this craft, and what do I need to know? And you can do a lot of that before you even, before you even start. So to see, is it something sustainable? Is it something I can afford? Is it something that I have the space for? So
Yeah, that's really good advice. Absolutely. Now you talked about being inspired by other creators and other types of mediums besides paper making. You mentioned quilting, like what I do, but also other places. What are some things that inspire your work and inspire you?
that's a question that I've been asked a number of times over the years, being interviewed, and I feel like I always have the same answer. Um, And I just feel like it's just the world around me. Now that sounds really cheesy. I get it, right? I don't mean to say like the world is my inspiration, but you know, again, because I don't have like these clear design idols, right? In the world, like in the in terms of luminaries of design, my inspiration kind of always comes from the world around me, especially the print world, right? Back in the day when magazines were a little more common, I would just pull things out of magazines, whether it was just one type treatment that I thought, that's really cool. I would save it, or a color palette that I would see that someone else spent time coming up with, and they're going to do this a lot better than me, but I can take those colors and I can apply it to a scrapbook page or a card project. I think there is so much inspiration in the world from a visual standpoint, from a design standpoint, and I try to stay open to that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I try to not ever think that I know everything, so that I can take inspiration from things that cross the visual field, and I pin them up to a bulletin board over my shoulder, and I come back to them and think, what can I take from this? Because that's something I believe about design, is nothing is new. Nothing is really all that new. It's all about interpretation. And true, there are ways to originally interpret old ideas, but design to me seems to be something that is just recycling and adapting and borrowing from things that have already existed in the world. So now I'm getting a little esoteric on you, but you know what I
No, I do. I do
but
understand.
then there are card makers too. Like when I started doing this, and there are people who are friends of mine and who have become friends of mine who I saw their cards and I'm like, oh, that's what you can do. You can do that. Like just bringing in this minimal aesthetic and these beautiful but simple techniques. There's a number of people that I see their work on social media, and I think I want to make cards like that. So for the card making world, I definitely am inspired by what I see people out there creating.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's so great to have platforms like Instagram and YouTube and Facebook and have these places where you can go and get inspired and take a look at what other people are doing. Because I know as a crafter myself, there have been many times when I see something on social media, I'm like, ooh, I like that, but I want to tweak it and make it mine. So it's that.
Yeah. In fact, I will mention at least a couple people. There's she's a good friend of mine, and I design with her for this company, Simon Says Stamp, but her name's Christina Warner. She is Star of May on Instagram, and she, I think more than any other person, like she'll post something and I'll look at it and I'll be like, I want to try that. You know what I mean? Like I feel like she's very original in what she does, and she inspires me a lot. And I have a lot of things that I've copied of hers where I'm like, oh, it's pretty good. Not as good, but that's part of the joy of finding inspiration and trying it yourself and having a little bit of pride because you did something that you didn't think you could do. And for me, again, as a person who initially thought, well, you're not that artistic, figuring out that I can use watercolors and I can do things with stamping and inking that I would never have thought I could do. So finding people that inspire you to try and maybe copy what they're doing in the best of ways, right? Not copying and taking it as your own, but just like, I'm gonna see if I can do what she did. That's been really fun for me too. And I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from watching other makers in the craft world. So
Yeah, absolutely. Taking it on and changing it up and figuring out what works best for you. I think that's really important and
yeah,
part of the process for being a maker as well.
mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yep.
Imitation, man, I'm telling you, that is, well, and that's how I think I learned to be a graphic designer. I saw styles of print that I liked and I wanted to emulate those. I mean, to this day, you know, I look at things like the Target logo and I get all mushy inside because it's just this classic Helvetica. How can you go wrong with that? You know, like seeing minimal design inspired me over the years, seeing design that communicated beautifully, that didn't draw too much attention to itself. That's the design I love. And that is what I think I brought into my designing for the craft industry. Minimal, clean, not drawing too much attention to itself, but serving the story or serving the message. That's my jam. That's my
awesome.
jam.
That's really, really cool. Well, Cathy, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me on the Maker Showcase and telling everybody about what you do. So thank you so much for joining me.
Ian, thank you so much. It has been so fun to get to know you outside of this realm. I really appreciate that you thought of me. And again, I love our Texas connection. And I hope your viewers enjoy this. And I hope it inspires them to explore their own inner artist and get out there and start creating.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you guys for watching today. I really do appreciate it. And don't forget, we do the Maker Showcase every second Saturday of each month. So make sure to come back and check out next month. See you guys next time.